Remember, all of you tweeters out there, hashtag KYBiz for your tweets. I know the Chamber would appreciate you doing as much of that as you can this morning. Also, again, the presentations by some of the speakers will all be available to you on the Chamber website later this week. You just have to look for it on their website. And the last thing is that if you're like me, you love a good survey, don't you? You just love a good survey. But if it's your company, you love a good survey. And when people give you feedback, and the Chamber is going to probably send you something soon in your email if they don't have those already to you about the survey for this year's annual meeting. And I think it will be very, very helpful to them if you can take just a moment. They make it easy and simple and fill that out. One of the other things I think they've asked me to remind you of, we have such outstanding speakers. You're challenged and presented with so many facts and figures. If you have a thought or two or a question or a comment that you would like, please don't hesitate to go to the microphones. I think somebody told me just at the very end of Mr. James' presentation, somebody was making their way up to the mic, and I apologize for not seeing that person. So if you do have questions or comments, please don't be hesitant to get up and dialogue with these speakers. One of those, I'm going to ask Will to come back up to the microphone just very quickly, if he will, because two people during the break said to Jim Ford and to myself, they were really intrigued by what Will said about the hydrogen-fueled automobile, but the question was, and they wanted to ask the question, but they didn't get up to the microphone in time, is where are you going to get that hydrogen fuel? How many stations are going to be built? Where are they going to be built? Are there any built now? So I thought we would borrow a little bit of Virginia Edwards' time and ask Will to respond to that, and then maybe out of that there might be something else that you'd like to ask. Will.
Okay, that's a very good question. And honestly, right now, the company is in the process of working through some different collaborations to be able to facilitate that. Hydrogen is not, readily available for everyone across this country. So we're starting initially in the state of California. We've got an agreement with the state of California to build a number of hydrogen filling stations across that state. And we'll use that sort of as the model to move the process of being able to get access to hydrogen across the country. We expect that the majority of the initial hydrogen-filled vehicles will be on the West Coast. And once we get that work through, then we'll work this way. But the idea is to collaborate with other companies that have access to be able to build the hydrogen fill stations, and we believe that as necessary, we, Toyota, and others that will be entering into that fuel cell space, other auto manufacturers, will be able to maybe work together to be able to put that infrastructure in place. In a perfect world, honestly, in a perfect world, I think when you've got new technologies like that have obvious benefits for society, that those are things that government should start talking about. How do they help to facilitate to put that infrastructure in place to be able to allow that benefit to come to fruition for all of us as quickly as possible. But at this point, that isn't the direction that things are moving in. So we, Toyota, and other auto manufacturers are going to have to work with other companies to be able to facilitate that. I wish I could tell you something that was a lot more conclusive. I wish I could tell you we're going to build a hydrogen fuel station in Georgetown, come on by and plug in. But I'm not at a point to say that. But hydrogen is available. It's just not as available, obviously as we're traditionally used to seeing it in gas stations. But one of the things that we have also found is when you do put these hydrogen fuel stations in place, you need considerably less of those hydrogen refill stations than you need of gas. So It's not going to be as significant as, you know, your Shells and your Chevrons and so forth, gas stations all over. It'll be quite a few less with hydrogen, because there'll be quite a few less needed. But right now, they're working through the details of being able to facilitate that.
Fair enough? Yes, sir. Of course.
That's all you
Thanks
need?
again. Yes, sir. Thanks, Will. Let's talk about education with Virginia Edwards. Here to introduce Ms. Edwards, Rusty Chevron, Director of Community and State Relations with the Brown-Forman, our session sponsor. In his role at Brown-Forman, Rusty oversees and implements the company's community relation activities, employee volunteer programs, and corporate contributions. Please welcome Rusty Chevron to the stage.
Thank you very much, and a little shout out to Bill real quick and all of his colleagues at KET. Thank you for being here and your great work that you do with the Chamber all the time, but also the great job you do for all of us here in the Commonwealth by keeping us informed and educated and entertained. There's no question KET is one of our finest institutions, and we're really grateful for what you do. Yeah. And I really like Will's Kentucky Proud theme that we have, and I just so happen to be sitting next to Governor Martha Lane Collins, whose great visionary leadership helped bring Toyota to Kentucky. So thank you, Governor, for all that you've done. And now my shameless 30-second commercial that we get to have. I'm really proud also as a lifelong Kentuckian to also be representing today my 4,000 colleagues at Brown-Forman. This 144-year-old Kentucky company that was founded in Kentucky and continues to be headquartered in Kentucky today is selling some of the world's finest bourbon, Woodford Reserve, some of the finest whiskeys, Jack Daniels, vodka, Finlandia, tequila, Herradura, all over the world, in fact, in about 156 countries. So we're really proud that Kentucky is our global headquarters, and we continue to employ a lot of people and invest in this community, and we're a proud member of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. So sit back and pretend you're having a Finlandia Bloody Mary right now, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Who is Virginia Edwards, as Bill said. She is president of Editorial Projects in Education. Virginia oversees the nearly 100-person, $16 million a year nonprofit corporation that publishes Education Week and edweek.org. She has held that post since 1997. Ms. Edwards has been the editor-in-chief of Education Week, the premier newspaper of record for pre-collegiate education in the United States since 1989. And for the past 19 years, she has also served as the editor of edweek.org, which reaches an audience of more than 1.2 million registered users. Previously, Ms. Edwards worked for the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and before that, it all comes back to Kentucky, folks. She was the editor and reporter at the Courier-Journal here in Louisville. So please give a great Kentucky welcome to Ms. Virginia Edwards.
Good morning. So I have a cold and it's in my chest. So if I have to have a hacking spell or something, send me good vibes and help me get over it. And maybe we'll take questions in the middle instead of waiting till the end. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here today. Thank you, Dave, and your colleagues at the Chamber for inviting me to participate in this important event. The fact is, not only does it give me a chance to go down my own, take my own trip down memory lane, but it also gives me a chance to give back to the state I care so much about. In my own little way, I try to get back to Kentucky a lot and talk about the remarkable work that's underway here to improve schools and to improve outcomes for kids. So as you've just heard, I've got a lot of connections to education, but that's not all. Those aren't all my connections. I'm a proud product of Ballard High School here in Louisville. Yay! It was in the second graduating class. I received 2 meaningful degrees from the University of Kentucky, one in journalism and one in political science. And even as a student journalist in Kentucky, first in high school and then in college, I was drawn to this world of education policy and education reporting. In fact, as serendipity would have it, I first met Bob Sexton. You all know, or many of you know Bob Sexton, I'm sure, the longtime, unfortunately late, executive director of the Pritchard Committee. I was a 17-year-old college freshman at UK. I was working on the Kentucky Kernel, and Bob was a very young college administrator heading up the Office of Experiential Education. My article on Dr. Sexton's work to connect students to the real world of work was one of my first stories to appear in the Kernel, all 10 inches of it. And Bob reminded me several times over the years, he thought the article was okay enough. It was the headline that he had an issue with. It was something like, "Students get credit for ditching class." Oops. An early lesson for me, and perhaps for him, that headlines are written by somebody other than the reporter. So now fast forward 40 years, and I had a hand in another newspaper story that intersects with Kentucky's workforce. This one about your work and the work of other state chambers of commerce to defend the Common Core state standards against increasingly vocal opposition to the new benchmarks for student learning. The article appeared in the newspaper I now edit, Education Week, as you see, earlier this year. My reporting colleague who wrote the story quoted Dave Atkinson extensively, not only because he's the CEO of this very well-regarded state chamber here in Kentucky, but also because he chairs the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Education, Employment, and Training Committee. It makes me wonder, by the way, why I'm up here and he's not. In our reporting, we characterize the national chamber as well as state chambers with all your long-standing relationships, your networks, and your well-established resources as among the most proactive and highly regarded interest groups in education. We reported that you all are defending the Common Core on grounds that the standards are essential to business interests and the long-term economic viability of this state. I'll give you a little more on that in a bit if you're interested. The story was also about the fact that the state chambers throughout the country are watching Kentucky, like so many have watched Kentucky over the past few decades on education, in large part because Kentucky was the first state to adopt the Common Core. In fact, as you all know, Kentucky has already administered its first tests based on the standards. And while Kentucky did experience some drops in student scores, and that was anticipated, there really was relatively little pushback. And it's also pretty darn clear that it was a major public relations, or public information, I should say, campaign that included the chamber that helped diffuse public outcry against testing score drops. And more specifically, again, as I'm sure most of you know, I'm telling you your own story, it was Dave Atkinson and Commissioner Terry Holliday who conducted a whistle-stop tour through the state, giving 15 joint presentations around the Commonwealth to help explain the Common Core and manage expectations. I gotta tell you, that's not happening in other states, and it is why there's a ton of pushback, I would argue. To mobilize supporters, you all also have worked with the Pritchard Committee on an initiative to launch the Business Leaders Champions for Education, which brings 75 of your business executives together on behalf of this important issue. Now, one of the reasons I'm talking about this in these ways is because I'm a big believer in getting the big frame right on how we talk about issues, and then how we position these issues as we talk with the public and others who care about the outcomes. I think the direct line you've drawn between education and jobs is absolutely, completely right. And as you say on your own website, Kentucky's economic well-being is inextricably linked to the education and skills of its citizens. We heard from Mr. James. I think that's been clear. There's a theme already running through this morning. The relationship between educational excellence and economic growth is more critical today than it has ever been. In our modern economy, competition comes from nations on the other side of the world, not just from neighboring states. Kentucky must be focused and relentless in its work to create a system of education that is truly world class. All Kentuckians have a role to play, none more important than the state's business community. So, at the risk of sounding a wee bit full of myself, I do think my 25-year tenure as the editor of Education Week has given me a catbird seat to gain some perspective on K-12 education and how we've gotten to where we are today across the nation, in this state, in general. By definition, I'm a journalist, I'm a chronicler, I'm a synthesizer, I'm a documenter, I'm an analyzer of the state of play in pre-collegiate education and the transition to what follows. I'll talk a little more about this later, but that's of course either post-secondary education, career, or certainly some combo of those two. In other words, I'm one of those real annoying, mile wide, inch deep kind of people. So you guys can call me out on that if you'd like at some point. But I also, when I have a chance to talk in forums like this, I also provide a disclaimer. At Education Week, or as a journalist, I'm careful not to go spouting my mouth off too much. And my stage direction says I'm supposed to wink here. Because on one side of the ledger is the fact that Education Week, which is wrapping up its 33rd year, haven't been there all those years, it's gained stature as an independent, objective chronicler of American education by carefully preserving our integrity and our credibility. And I do take that very, very seriously. And as a journalist, I'm not supposed to have opinions, right? And I know that that could be up for some debate. But I will tell you that as a journalist, I'm not one of those people who believe I'll betray my profession if I harbor notions of civic responsibility or care about the purpose or impact of my work. I have no trouble arguing, for instance, that journalists need to pull back from their racehorse coverage of issues and take a far more active role in getting Americans involved in public affairs. Journalists, I think, should be catalysts for the reinvigoration of civic life, for community improvement, and for the public empowerment of its citizenry. And I would argue that journalism at its core has always had the goal of the betterment of society. So I do have a point of view. It's that this country needs and deserves better schools, and that all students should have access to high-quality teaching and high-quality curricula and other high-quality services and supports. The bottom line, I think, must be working to ensure better outcomes for all kids. Just this morning, and a true story, as they like to say, I went to sign a check that I had been putting off mailing, that I needed to drop in the mail, and I was moving very quickly, and as I finished signing the check, I realized I'd signed it Virginia B. Education. I have never done that. That was weird. ED Education instead of Edwards. All right, so here's a little more of my trip down memory lane that I hope also teases up some issues. I was the managing editor of the Kernel at UK in my junior year, and then I was editor in my senior year. So I had my pick of beats. So what did I decide to tackle? Like the wonk in waiting that I am, I decided to take on the rather arcane world of higher education policy. For some of you folks in this room, I'm even older than that cohort that Chuck Todd talked about. So for those of you who are in my class, you'll remember the big story at the time was how to define and differentiate the missions among UK, U of L, and the 6 regional universities in the public system. And if you're not as excited by that topic as I am, you know, your loss, I guess. It was really heady stuff for a budding edu nerd. Next stop is after UK, I did go to the Courier-Journal. I joined it right out of college, and I spent more than 7 years as an editor there, including a stint on the regional desk. That's the part of the paper at the time that covered the 117 counties outside the Louisville metro area. You remember those days, maybe? The Courier had bureaus throughout the state: Paducah, Hazard, Bowling Green, Bardstown, Somerset, and of course Lexington and Frankfort. One of the high points of my time there was that I got to help edit an exhaustive series the CJ ran in 1984 on the state's educational shortcomings. It also turns out to be a point when a mentor of mine at the paper encouraged me to go off and get some reporting experience. I kind of had a backward career, right? At first an editor and then a reporter. He said he wanted me to get that experience before it was too late. Not sure what that meant, but so off I went to cover education in Kentucky's State House. I want to say hello to Governor Collins. I will make sure to do that personally in a bit. I look back fondly on those years, both for what they meant for my own professional development as a public policy journalist, but also for what they portended for Kentucky and the advocates, policymakers, and pundits, politicians intent on ensuring a better education for youngsters throughout the state. But changes were in the wind. In 1986, within a few months of the announcement that the CJ was going to be sold, I pulled up stakes from Kentucky and moved to Washington to help edit this relatively new publication called Education Week. And as you heard in the intro, except for a couple-year detour working for the Carnegie Foundation, I've been there ever since. So I do try to get back to Kentucky often, as I said. And I promise it's not merely state pride or the opportunity to talk in settings like this one, this very important nationally recognized chamber meeting that compels me to be here today. It boils down to the fact that Kentucky's school improvement story, its education reform story, is a genuinely fascinating one that commands national interest and respect. Now, I can go into some of this, and I will go through it quickly. So I don't know how much of this background you want to hear, but because it's a while ago, but it does lay the foundation for why Kentucky commands so much attention even today. After languishing so many years at the bottom of the educational heap, Kentucky has attained a special stature in the school reform community and is rightfully held up as a standard bearer for systemic change. Do you all really know what a beacon you all have been for the rest of the country with education improvement? It's really remarkable. I run into people all the time. And there, by the way, there's a cabal of us at the national level from Kentucky who all kind of have a secret, give it up for Kentucky motion, because we are all out there talking about this story. Indeed, if you follow the 30-year timeline of Kentucky's successes, and there's no getting around it, it's had stumbles as well, you'll see that they mirrored and in many cases helped to inform and shape school change across the nation. So the beginning of the story, as you guys always hear in education talks, is in 1983, at the beginning of an extremely key period in American education. That's when the galvanizing report, A Nation at Risk, came out and talked about a rising tide of mediocrity in U.S. education. Nearly as important in my mind was what was unfolding throughout the South. This is something I'm proud of. States from Mississippi to the Carolinas to Arkansas and Tennessee, and yes, Kentucky, another shout out to Governor Collins, were confronting the failings of their public education systems and ambitiously organizing themselves to do something about it. Many of you will likely remember that governors were often the lead players, and indeed many of these education governors made names for themselves during this period. Governor Hunt of North Carolina, Governor Clinton of Arkansas, Governor Riley of South Carolina, Governor Alexander of Tennessee, to name just a scant handful. Schooling, which at this point had wholly been viewed as a local district enterprise, was becoming more defined in state terms. And I think it's also important to point out that southern states were generally marshaling an economic argument and making their case for better schools. My personal take is that the nation owes a huge debt of gratitude to the southern states collectively for their early efforts to launch the school improvement movement that continues to this day. And of course, the announcement of Toyota coming to Kentucky was exactly in that time frame. But it wasn't just the governors and the political leaders who were mobilizing in the name of better schools. Advocates were becoming more and more vocal and organized. And nowhere was that energy more evident and the optimism more evident than in Kentucky. The Pritchard Committee for Academic Excellence, the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, Ashland Oil Company, and the press stepped up as well. Local television stations and local media, otherwise newspapers, including some stories I wrote, I'd like to think, helped carry the message to every community in the state, calling for reforms in all areas of education, from early education, childhood services, to the status of teachers, to the way the state paid for schools. Advocates' message became a rallying point. But it wasn't just the specific vision that held sway, and this is really something I want to underscore. Equally important, perhaps even more important, is the incredible determination and focus that was brought to bear on the task of bringing that vision to life. What makes Kentucky's story so instructive, I think, is the way the state harnessed public sentiment, the way it took an oft-overlooked resource seriously, nurtured it, and translated it into action. Kentucky remains, to this day, the nation's single best example of statewide public engagement in the task of improving schools for all children. Excuse me, I'm skipping. So I'd like to put a now contemporary frame on this conversation and tell you how we're thinking about where we are in the next chapter of school improvement in the nation. Generally speaking, our thinking at EdWeek is shaped by the idea that disruptive innovation has come to virtually every sector of the U.S. economy. To remain relevant, companies and whole sectors have walked nimbly and aggressively to transform and reinvent over the last decade or so. Excuse me, think retail sales, think publishing, think media. A common theme has been our willingness to embrace change. America's leaders and much of the public have come to realize that an education system born in the industrial age can no longer effectively serve students in a complex, rapidly changing information age. The world is changing at a startling pace. I don't know that I'd drive one of those cars without, or be in a car that doesn't have a driver. Propelled by technology and fueled by intimate interconnectedness of a competitive global economy. So this is a litany of skills you know. To be prepared for the 21st century, what the 21st century will bring, students need to be armed with relevant knowledge and new sets of skills and capabilities that allow them to think creatively and critically, adapt to and thrive in a changing environment, devise new solutions to novel problems, leverage technologies not yet conceived, work collaboratively, and communicate clearly and with purpose. But I'll tell you what, education generally has been pretty absent from this party of figuring out how to reimagine what it does and how it does it, and therefore change. That is changing, though. Because of economic and global imperatives, among other pressures, K-12 education is poised to rethink a century-old system of schooling and to embrace a new generation of policies, programs, and products that will lead, I think, to disruptive as well as sustaining innovation in the field. While many eye these developments warily, others see great opportunity. Now, I know it's a cliche, and a lot of people have talked about this kind of spectacular moment in time we find ourselves in education, but again, I believe it. Among many other factors, the education marketplace and innovation in education are being spurred by agreement that all students need these 21st century skills. Indeed, to use the rhetoric, to be college and career ready, to succeed in today's interdependent, fast-changing world. These changes are also being spurred by advances in our understanding of how students learn and the power, the like brain science kind of stuff. and the power of data and analytics to leverage more meaningful student engagement. They're also being spurred by technological leaps in communications, networking, and adaptive response that make deeper and personalized learning a reality. They're being spurred by policy developments at the federal, and I always put in parentheses, national, because there's a difference between federal and national at times, state and local levels that are intended to encourage innovation and think differently about teaching and learning. They're also being spurred by economic realities, to tell you the truth, that are driving policymakers and educators to think outside the box and embrace more effective and more efficient and productive models that enhance student learning and break down traditional notions of time and space. So I've got a bit of a mishmash going here across a bunch of points that I wanted to share. And here's where I would say, in my mind, there are three kind of general areas that we all need to be thinking very differently about in transforming schools, including schools in Kentucky. One is we do have to think about using time and space differently, particularly in a move to a system of competency-based learning. Time and space, meaning seat time, shouldn't be the only indicator now of whether kids, young people, have really mastered the content. That it shouldn't be defined by a school day that has a hard beginning and a hard end, and it shouldn't be defined by a year that has a hard beginning and a hard end. We also have to think about how we use our human capital resources differently. And that means we need to be open to the idea of embracing differentiated staffing and a new approach to recruiting, retaining, and rewarding people at the heart of the system. That's teachers and administrators and other education leaders. And that's not easy, as you can well imagine. We also, as a third kind of bullet point, need to figure out how to continue and build on these efforts to foster innovation. We have to leverage the heck out of the opportunities that technology offers to engage kids and elevate learning. I am not someone who believes technology will replace teachers, far from it. It's just a tool. But used well, I think it can be a real game changer. So I'm going to shift gears yet again and talk a little bit. Mr. James talked about it, the skills gap, and why I think education needs to be focusing on it. One of the most fundamental obligations of any society is to prepare its adolescents and young people to lead productive and prosperous lives as adults. This means preparing all young people with a solid enough foundation of literacy, numeracy, and thinking skills for responsible citizenship, career development, and lifelong learning. Yet, as we find ourselves 14 years into the new century, there are profoundly troubling signs that the U.S. is failing to meet its obligation to prepare millions of young adults. So in an era in which education has been more important than ever to economic success, the United States is falling behind many other nations in educational attainment and achievement. This is where I bring up the growing evidence of a skills gap, in which many young adults flat out lack the skills and work ethic needed for many jobs to pay a middle-class wage. Simultaneously, there's been a dramatic decline in the ability of adolescents and young people to find work. You can all think about the implications of that in your own approaches to these issues. Indeed, the percentage of teens and young adults who have jobs is now at the lowest level since World War II. So the youngsters in this group of folks who are not being prepared have been sometimes called the forgotten half. You may have heard that term. And it is actually deepened over the last couple of decades. So in 1973, people with a high school education or less made up 72% of the nation's workforce. In an economy in which manufacturing was still dominant, it was possible for those with less education but a strong work ethic to earn a middle-class wage. In effect, a high school diploma was a passport to the American dream for millions of Americans. But by just, more recently, by 2007 is when I saw this, this picture had changed beyond recognition. While the workforce had exploded nearly 70%, those with a high school education or less had shrunk to 41% of the workforce. Over the past 3.5 decades or so, all the net job growth in America has been generated by portions that require at least some post-secondary education. Say that again. Over the past 3.5 decades, all the net job growth in this country has been generated by positions that require at least some post-secondary education. I've got a little more to say about what that post-secondary education can look like. Based on the last numbers I saw, it's an analysis of 2010 earnings. The lifetime earnings gap between those with a high school education and those with a college degree was about $1 million. And there's evidence that that differential is widening. And going forward, these trends will only intensify. Although labor market projections, like all economic forecasts, are inherently uncertain, the Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University projects that nearly 2/3 of the jobs projected to be created by the end of the decade will require that workers have at least some post-secondary education. Even if the center has overestimated its demand for post-secondary credentials, the long-term trend is undeniable. The message is clear. In 21st century America, education beyond high school is now the passport to the American dream. The question is how much beyond high school and what kind of post-secondary education is really needed to prosper in the new American economy. This is not uncontroversial, by the way, to talk about these issues down to the nub of, are we talking about college for all, or anyway, I fully admit that. The Georgetown Center projects that 14 million job openings, nearly half of those will be filled by workers with post-secondary education. Will go to people with an associate's degree or an occupational certificate. Many of those will be in middle skills occupations: electricians, construction managers, dental hygienists, paralegals, and police officers. While those jobs can be seen, God, I have trouble even saying this out loud, maybe as a little less prestigious to some of those that are filled by folks who get their bachelor's, they pay a significant premium over many jobs open to those with only a high school degree. And more surprisingly, they pay more than many jobs held by those with bachelors. There will also be a huge number of job openings in the so-called blue-collar fields like construction, manufacturing, and natural resources. And some of those will be to replace some of us retiring baby boomers. But there will be 800 new job openings, and 2.7 million of those will require a post-secondary credential. In commercial construction, manufacturing, mining and installation and repair, this kind of post-secondary education, as opposed to a BA, is often a ticket to a well-paying and rewarding career. So I'll be happy to answer some questions on this in Q&A, but I hope you're hearing the differentiation where people used to talk about, college for all as if all young people or others would go on and get these 4-year degrees at what we think of as traditional universities and colleges. And it's turning out that a more fine-grained look at these issues is just imperative, and a crosswalk between economic development needs in a state and the education needed to fill those jobs is what's needed. So, focusing more precisely on future employer demand illuminates part of the challenge, but there's also a problem on the supply side. That's partly what I was just teeing up. Increasingly, U.S. employers complain that today's young adults are not equipped with the skills they need to succeed in the 21st century. If the U.S. is going to make dramatic progress in reclaiming its historic leadership position in post-secondary attainment, it's going to have to focus much more attention and resources on programs and pathways that do not require a bachelor's degree, but do prepare young people for middle skills jobs. By calling attention to the central role that community colleges, vocational training programs, and apprenticeships can play in moving us toward that goal of greater post-secondary attainment, proponents are acknowledging that the college for all rhetoric that has been so much a part of the current school improvement movement needs to be significantly broadened to become a post-high school credential for all. Not exactly rhetorically coming off my tongue. And I'm glad that so much work here in Kentucky has also been done on these issues. And they too are getting national notice, even though my area is more K-12 than post-secondary. So I've got a couple more points to make, and I hope I'm not going on too long. I want to underscore what I hope is an important and relevant to this audience point. So for much of the past few decades, the education reform movement has focused pretty squarely on the academic and content areas that needed attention, and of course that was rightfully so. But increasingly, the non-academic factors that help or hinder student learning, whether a student feels safe or valued in school, for example, or is motivated to study and succeed, are getting more attention. Over the years, the staff writers at Education Week, we've chronicled dozens of trends and developments in education and written thousands of articles covering K-12. But when it comes to the often invisible issues related to school climate and student engagement, we decided we could do more. So over the past couple years, we've bolstered our coverage in three kind of related areas: school climate, student engagement and motivation, and social and emotional learning. And I hope that echoes for you business people in the room. After all, we know that learning doesn't come just from books and teachers. Emerging research shows that students' academic performance is affected by a school's climate, from the physical building and its safety to the atmosphere and social interaction fostered by adults on campus. As accountability pressures intensify, some schools are paying more attention to climate issues that set the stage for children to learn. Research also shows that when students are taught to problem solve, to get along with others, to speak in public, to persevere in the face of adversity, often called grit and perseverance, their achievement actually increases. So focusing on skills like self-awareness, self-management, decision-making, and getting along with others, again, social and emotional learning has great power to improve outcomes. The non-academic traits that are pivotal to students' success, which are often articulated in character education and social emotional learning programs, I believe may represent an underused tactic in the national push for college readiness. So we put a report out back in June that I would commend to your attention. It's called Diplomas Count. It can be found on our website, edweek.org. And we wanted to find out about perspectives on student engagement and motivation. And the results, I think, offer some important insights about the level of engagement and dedication that teachers and school folks more generally see in their students. I don't want to inundate you with numbers, but let me give you a few. Only 4 in 10 respondents, these are teachers and administrators, believe that a majority of students at their schools are highly engaged and motivated. That number drops to 26% of respondents from high poverty schools and 32% of respondents serving grades 9 through 12. Part of that underscores a problem we've got in this country with high school. More than half of those surveyed believe that too little attention is given to promoting student engagement and motivation at their schools. Only 3% feel that too much attention is paid to such efforts. And finally, we asked teachers and administrators an open-ended question to identify the most effective strategies they use to engage and motivate their students. Number 1, using a variety of interactive and hands-on activities. And that's, again, where I would say the business community can be so important to the cause, whether through internships and mentorships and authentic learning experiences. Otherwise, I think business can crosswalk with educators in ways that truly engage and motivate kids. So I'm coming around the bend. In wrapping up, I've got two kind of big picture points to make that will kind of echo, or you'll hear echoes in what I've already said. First, I think policymakers and educators, and the public for that matter, increasingly or need to really get hip to the fact that American education, Kentucky education, is a matter with global consequences. The fact is, academic gains made by competitors halfway around the world are jeopardizing the United States' future economic prospects. So it's that much energy and effort is going to the task of reassessing the knowledge and skills needed to succeed in a competitive economy. At the same time, states are weighing plans to gauge how their schools are measuring up against Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and Finland, and other European nations. They're all perennial leaders on international assessments that, by the way, are good assessments. These are these are not bubble tests. These are real tests of cognitive skills. Ironically, or maybe not so ironically, the warnings echo the alarm set off in a nation at risk. See how I'm coming around? Like it or not, we are now members of a global community. And like it or not, we are not among the top performing nations in the world. The bottom line is that the disparities in student achievement between the United States and other countries has shifted the focus from state-by-state comparisons to international benchmarking. Number two, this is the other big wrap-up point. The time has come to replot the education landscape, education policy landscape, with a map that identifies the increasing importance of cross-sector issues. So what do I mean by that? It's the idea that policymaking and practice must reflect a more holistic view, one that views education as a pipeline that spans the preschool years, and I would even say prenatally, believe it or not, through the years that follow high school. It's essential that policymakers and practitioners commit to better understanding and strengthening the connections between K-12 education and the larger constellation of systems and institutions that shape both pre-collegiate education and that are shaped by it. So even more specifically, more attention is needed on the transition points between K-12 education and the systems that encompass child well-being and early childhood education on the one end, and post-secondary education and career training on the other. So, my big finish. Kentucky, and indeed the nation, has generally been making tracks on a school reform path for at least a quarter century, really more like 30 years now. So what's the key to making continued progress down that path? You guys have it. You've put it in a bottle. You need an expansive vision, you need systemic strategies, you need public will, and you need a stick-to-itiveness. I think it's the recipe for success in Kentucky and the recipe for success for school improvement and better outcomes for kids nationwide. Thank you very much for inviting me today, and I'll be happy to take questions. Rush the microphones.
Thanks, Virginia. We will encourage people to get to the microphones. I think I see hopefully,
It's a rush.
Here they come. It's a rush. It's a mad rush. More than we've had. That's good. Would you mind going to the microphone, please?
There's one right there.
Oh, there's one up here. You're going to come all the way to the front. Gosh,
Critical
we're
thinking
impressed.
skills.
This one's a little taller for me, I think. I'd like to just ask you to respond to how you think K through 12, especially around the country, may be adjusting to two major shifts, or at least one major shift in education and then a potential major shift, to see if they are, number one, recognizing it, and how are they going to deal with it? How will it affect how they educate? The first major shift is with the so-called non-traditional student. The non-traditional student, as we used to know it, is now the traditional student. The high school graduate who goes straight from high school into college, attends day classes, lives on campus, is now in the minority, and that will change more and more over time. That's one shift. The other shift is the move towards competency-based education, where as you move through and master material, you move on. You don't have to, it's not based on seat time anymore. Is K through 12 recognizing that, number one, and how will it affect, if they are, how they educate in the future?
Yeah, your first question has a lot of post-secondary, at least I'm inferring, in it. Although K-12 has, I think, done a remarkably good job of identifying the problem of high school dropouts as part of that pipeline, and non-traditional students are certainly in that cohort as well. And I do think post-sec has done a really quite good job of recognizing the problem. You know who I think is resistant to the changes? Is the broader public. We all know the education systems that we all went to, and frankly, most of us thrived as a part of. And I think this whole notion of disrupting what's going on today is the real, hard work that has to happen. In my own organization, when I started really reconceiving what we could look like as a publishing, media, journalistic outfit, that work started 20 years ago, and we don't look anything like we did then. It was hard. I got lots of scratches on my back from my colleagues. I think some of the folks who are resistant are some of the rank and file in these organizations and institutions, but also the public. So I think there's kind of a will building kind of aspect to this. I don't know if I'm answering. The short answer is I think it's well recognized. The hard work is what are we going to do about it. On competency-based, that one's even more disruptive when you think about all the policies and practices that would have to shift, including statutes. And there's the best work going on that is in New Hampshire, where they've changed their whole system to a competency-based, not seat time-based approach, where you have to show that you've mastered certain skills and competencies, and then you move on. You can get dual college career, you can get out of high school early. It's all meant to be, some of the lingo around this is student-centered, differentiated, kind of opportunities for more authentic, deeper learning. So there's a lot of energy behind it, but change is hard. I had a whole nother part of my talk about, what I think are the kind of change levers, and my biggest one is building public and political will for these things, and that's what I think Kentucky's done very well.
Thank you.
Don't know if that's helpful, but there you go. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm an old retired chemistry professor from the University of Louisville, and I've been working with local schools, K through 12, to try to get more of our students motivated. And you mentioned changing the culture in the schools to get them engaged more. And I wanted to see if you have any thoughts about something that happened in the cultural world, in the corporate world, back in 1889, when Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits, came out. And a lot of corporations changed their whole approach to accommodate those philosophies of those 7 habits. Sean Covey wrote a book for the teens, and that book is being adopted several places in Louisville, at Central High School, at Mill Creek Elementary on Dixie Highway, and it's having an impact on young people. And my question to you is that one way that you might see we could go about getting young people motivated to step into that gap and be the best they can be? Because if we don't get them pumped up about something, we're not going to change anything. And so I just want to put that question before you.
I couldn't agree more. That
Good.
the research has been done about these issues of how you change the culture, change whether it's a school district, even a classroom, but a school district, a kind of state approach. And the main findings are an intentionality around your vision and are being able to articulate that, working to get buy-in in an authentic way. It's all those same things again about, I know that I work intentionally every minute of the day on this culture of my organization. It's not an afterthought. Everything I do is to align with a culture of inclusiveness and innovation, and you know what I mean? So
Yes.
it starts with administrators and then leadership and then others coming together around a vision. And I think there are tools, and there are a lot of schools, districts, and even whole states that have made quite massive shifts on that, and way more has to be done. My one interjection here, caveat, so how many districts are there in the country? 14,000 plus. This is a big, messy enterprise. And it's really hard to talk about some of these things in generalities, which I always try not to do, except to say, you know, go to the Google, and not you, I'm saying so much is, you can find really promising practices, lessons learned, because a lot of folks have focused on that, and I think it's exactly right. It was part of the talk I didn't give. That was number one. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. It's been a great conversation. I think it even starts earlier. When I go, and I'm going to date myself, you know, I'll use the acronym PTA or site-based councils, but when I go I'm standing in front of parents, I'm talking from a chamber's perspective or economic development perspective, there seems to be a mismatch between the opportunities and the perception of those opportunities, and I don't have an answer. When I stand up and say, it's okay for little Johnny to be in a career and technical field. It's okay for him to be able to make a living wage and live in his community of choice, and these are the opportunities. But when they look at that, and it's not a 4-year track with a master's, but it's a great opportunity, and it meets his skill set, and he can be happy and provide for his family. I don't know what to do about that, and I'm struggling looking at my community, looking at the opportunities we have, and aligning it with our partners within the context of this is okay for parents to feel positive about their children going in this direction.
I'm going to take 2 stabs at that. Specifically on your specific question, I would, I mean, you know, you're right that we've got to be realistic about the kind of matching of need and ability and all that. I will say that there's been a chronic problem of you know, that kids and young people can do more than we sometimes expect they can. So we always have to push and not just give in to, you know, bad expectations around. And I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm just saying that there is a problem. Educators themselves will, you know, can talk about how the culture of their own school building is one where they don't expect certain kids to achieve. That's bad, I think. But I'll tell you, part of my answer is, again, couldn't agree with you more, the mismatch between perceptions and reality. I just was saying to somebody earlier, I often, in social polite company, don't tell people what I do because I don't want to get an earful of all that's wrong with public education and all that's wrong with everything going on in public education today. It drives me crazy because they don't have a clue what's going on, many of them. And you try to talk, and they just won't hear anything of it. They'll just start spewing what the latest thing they've heard, and it's not connected to reality. So that's where, again, public information and public awareness and every effort we can think of to really crosswalk real world stuff, facts, data, expectations with, you know, the folks who can benefit from them. How many folks in this room have read the Common Core State Standards? Yes. I mean, anybody who starts talking about Common Core and can, you know, will start telling you things, and it's like, no, that's not in the Common Core. The Common Core State Standards are very sparse or very parsimonious, and so, you know, the hard work of implementing them and aligning them to assessments and accountability systems, there are a lot, and teacher preparedness, and there are a lot of issues that need to be worked on. But the problem, I would submit, is not that Common Core State Standards are, you know, giving teachers, they're giving teachers more running room to do creative work in their classrooms, I believe. Which of you was here first? You?
A quick
Fairness. What you model.
I appreciate it. You had mentioned that Kentucky, I'm using your exact words, has been for some decades a standard bearer for systemic change in education. And that's certainly true enough in some measure, but as employers, as business people, and importantly for many of us as parents, the operative question really is to what end? In change for the sake of change, we still struggle tremendously here in Kentucky with the end result. And my question is, as it relates to school choice, charter schools particularly, as someone who is a proponent of what is best for educating children and as someone who is a proponent of disruption, what is the stance of Education Week on school choice, charter schools specifically? And if you are proponents of it, what is being done through the publication to further that? And if you are not, why not?
We are a 501c3, which means we don't take stands on things.
But as an editorial board, I think you understand what I'm saying.
It was a joke.
I'm laughing on the inside.
I mean, you heard me. We're proponents of doing the hard work of improving schools and ensuring better outcomes for kids. I know it sounds like it just rolls off my tongue. So on the face of it, I'm agnostic on what those tactics are, but I am hugely in favor of trying a bunch of stuff. So, I mean, I don't know, if you want to put me in a corner, there's a spectrum there. Some states have very well-functioning chartering organizations that are leading to better charter schools than loosely governed chartering organizations where the charter schools are performing less well than the more traditional public schools. So again, you can't, paint with one paintbrush, but I'm for trying all kinds of different approaches. Back when DSEG was hot issue in Kentucky, remember magnet schools in Louisville? I mean, those were kind of an early form, if you think about it, of specialty schools where you were trying to match up kids' interests with other, kids' interests so that we could geographically move kids around in the name of desegregating schools. So, I think there can be reasons we try these different approaches. But honestly, I'm not being glib. We don't write our own editorials. We entertain commentary pieces from throughout the field. But it's part of the disruption, I wholly agree, and I think it's welcome to that extent.
One quick little follow-up to that. You're an observer of the educational arena. Obviously, you've been in this arena for quite some time. As it relates to what we're doing, all these changes that we are making, you mentioned the fact that on these international standards that we're starting to be leapfrogged by many countries. Have you ever seen the documentary 2 Million Minutes? There's 2 million minutes from the time you graduate from 8th grade to the time you graduate from high school. You have 2 million minutes. This follows 2 children in China, 2 in India, 2 in America. It's sobering. And for any business people here, it's worth watching. It's an hour or less. But so much of what is causing us to be leapfrogged is the fact that we keep reinventing the wheel. They're doing the same old rote things that we think are no good, that we think are passé. And those things that we have dismissed and thrown to the curb are being used to take us to task and to leapfrog us. Is that of concern to somebody who has followed this arena as you have?
Hey, look at this. I have a flashing red light.
And I'll sit down with that.
Sure it is. And I think, my cheerleading to you all is that the business community has a huge role to play in ensuring that the frame on this work is, a realistic one, supported by with great enthusiasm, real resources, not just money to, give kids the opportunity to go on a field trip, which may be, a nice thing to do. But I would say policy advocacy, which I know the Chamber is involved in, a real voice to bring change with respect to the levers that are the important ones in K-12 and post-sec education. You all have a huge voice, and this direct line now that's being drawn between economic development and education improvement is a real, is more, it's bigger than it's been, I would say, since the 80s when it kind of first burst onto the scene. And finally, I think that no business stands still. So I would take just a little issue with the idea that, we keep trying things and we move on to something else. I mean, the public education system is, as I've already said, is big, it's messy, it's got a lot of players with a lot of political interests, but there is more attention from more people who are trying to do it with the best intentions possible, not saying this very articulately, so that some of the noise, much of the noise, is a very small minority, relatively speaking, that we see in state after state or community after community. And I think it's about sticking with an agenda, being open to iterating and evolving, but keeping the, the focus on what ultimately matters, which is kids coming out of high school and out of college, or with whatever post-secondary credential, in a place to contribute meaningfully to the country, in communities, whether as a citizen, as a worker, as a family member. So, I mean, I just don't see any bigger agenda issue for business people than figuring out how to work intentionally and committedly with education, educators, and the policy behind it. So thank you very much.
Virginia, thanks so much, and welcome back to Kentucky. It was great to hear your observations and, of course, your kind words about our state. A lot of people in this room are folks who are working every day to try to make a difference in education. We've got a break now, so enjoy that, and be back here in 10 minutes. We're going to hear from Mike Duncan. So be back in 10 minutes. Okay.